The flat smell of aging paper and carbon ink filled the records room of the Bureau of Indian Affairs regional office, a stale, dry scent that settled in the back of the throat every morning before the heavy industrial ventilation fans were turned on. Raymond Sosi stood in the center of the silent archive, 40 minutes before the official start of the federal workday. The Albuquerque sun was already beginning to bake the asphalt of 4th Street outside, but inside the windowless storage matrix, the air was cool and dead. Sosi wore his usual brown sport coat, the elbows worn smooth from years of resting against laminate desks, his tie knotted with the precise, unyielding symmetry that defined his professional existence. He had a reputation among his colleagues for never making clerical errors. It was a reputation that had built his career, and it was a reputation that now suffocated him. He walked down the narrow aisle between the towering steel storage units, his rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the linoleum. He stopped in front of the San Juan Basin flat file cabinet. It was a massive, waist-high unit with wide, shallow drawers designed to hold original hand-drawn cadastral survey maps. Sosi reached out and wrapped his fingers around the brass pull of the third drawer down. He did not pull it open. He merely tested the tension, confirming that the locking mechanism was fully engaged. The metal was cold. He pushed his thumb against the keyhole cylinder, making absolutely certain it was depressed. The cabinet was locked. The map was secure. The single, altered digit resting in the dark inside that drawer was safe for the moment. Sosi exhaled a slow, measured breath, attempting to push the knot of anxiety down into his stomach, but the dread remained, a physical weight pressing against his ribs. At exactly 8 o'clock, the ventilation fans hummed to life with a deep, vibrating thrum, and the overhead fluorescent lights flickered on, casting a harsh, sterile glare over the rows of cabinets. 10 minutes later, the telephone on Sosi's meticulously clean desk rang. It was the front desk receptionist. "Raymond," the receptionist said, her voice crackling slightly over the internal line. "There is a woman here from the tribal council, a Miss Runningwater. She has a letter of authorization for the San Juan Basin Mineral Royalty Review." "I will be right out," Sosi said. His voice was flat, betraying nothing. He walked out to the main reception area. Standing before the heavy wooden counter was Della Runningwater. She was a woman who seemed to absorb the space around her rather than disrupt it. She wore a simple, tailored skirt and blouse, and slung over her shoulder was a heavy canvas satchel. In her hand, she held a formal letter of authorization printed on the heavy stock of the Navajo Tribal Council. Sosi approached the counter, his face a mask of bureaucratic courtesy. "Miss Runningwater," Sosi said, "I am Raymond Sosi. Deputy Director Spence has assigned me to serve as your document liaison for the duration of your audit." Runningwater handed him the letter. "Mr. Sosi, thank you." She did not smile, nor did she frown. Her demeanor was entirely neutral, methodical, and patient. She had been trained as a bookkeeper before the tribal council hired her as an auditor, and she carried the quiet authority of someone who understood that numbers did not require emotion. Sosi looked at the letter, though he already knew what it said. Harold Spence had orchestrated this arrangement perfectly. By assigning Sosi as the liaison, Spence had ensured that a trusted agent, or rather a thoroughly compromised one, stood squarely between the auditor and the archives. Spence, with his silver hair and his state senator photographs, treated the BIA as a personal fiefdom, and he had placed Sosi on the front line of this defense. "If you will follow me," Sosi said, handing the letter back, "I have set up a workspace for you in the document reading room." He escorted her down the long, linoleum-tiled corridor. The document reading room was a small, glass-walled enclosure situated off the main records floor. The particular yellow of the overhead fluorescent light in the room cast a sickly pallor over the heavy oak table, a trick of the spectrum that made the standard blue ink of government ledger entries look slightly green. Sosi gestured to the table, where a stack of heavy, leather-bound books was already waiting. These are the quarterly disbursement ledgers for the past 2 years, Sosi said, covering the San Juan Basin parcel block as requested. Running Water set her canvas satchel on the table and unbuckled the leather straps. She accepted the ledgers without comment. From her satchel, she withdrew a thick stack of ledger sheets, a wooden ruler, and a freshly sharpened pencil. She sat down, opened the first BIA ledger, and placed her own blank sheet beside it. She aligned the wooden ruler with the top edge of her paper. Sosi stood by the door and watched. The sound of Running Water's pencil ruling straight lines across her pre-prepared ledger sheets filled the small room. It was a steady, evenly spaced sound, executed without hesitation. Scratch, lift, align, scratch. She was drawing column headings, preparing to manually transcribe and reconcile thousands of individual royalty payments. The sheer mechanical efficiency of her working habit sent a cold spike of alarm through Sosi. This was not a woman who would skim. This was a woman who would touch every single number. She would find any numerical inconsistency because she was building the math from the ground up. Running Water finished ruling her first page and looked up. "Mr. Sosi, I will also need the original cadastral flat files for the San Juan Basin parcel block, the survey maps." Sosi met her gaze perfectly. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind for 10 days, ever since he had first seen her initial access request on the supervisor routing slip. "I can pull the ledgers on my own authority," Sosi said, his tone helpful but regretful. "However, the original cadastral flat files require a supervisor co-signature on the access request form before I can unlock the cabinet. It is a preservation protocol." Running Water looked at him for a long moment. The procedural step was technically real, a dusty regulation buried in the BIA administrative manual, though in practice, records clerks waived it daily to keep the workflow moving. Sosi was enforcing the letter of the law to build a wall. "How long does the co-signature process take?" she asked. "Usually 2 to 3 days," Sosi replied smoothly, "depending on the deputy director's schedule." "I see," Running Water said. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice or display any frustration. She merely nodded, accepting the bureaucratic obstruction as a simple data point, a condition of the weather. "Please initiate the request." "I will do it immediately," Sosi said. He left the reading room and walked back to his own desk. He pulled a triplicate access request form from his drawer and filled it out in his precise block lettering. He requested the San Juan Basin flat files on behalf of Della Running Water. He dated it correctly, stamping the current day's date in the upper right corner. Then he stood up and walked down the hall to the executive suites. Harold Spence's office was empty, the heavy mahogany door standing open. Spence rarely arrived before 9:30. Sosi walked over to the large, polished desk. A silver-plated in-tray sat on the corner, already holding a stack of morning memorandums and routing slips. Sosi took his freshly filled access request form and carefully slid it into the tray. He did not place it on top. He lifted the entire stack of pending paperwork and placed Running Water's request at the absolute bottom. It was a small, deliberate act. It left no documentary evidence of obstruction. The form was submitted, the date was accurate. But it guaranteed that Spence would not see it until the end of the day, or perhaps the next morning. It gave Sosi the delay he desperately needed. Returning to the records room, Sosi settled into his chair and began processing his own daily queue of allotment transfers. But his focus was shattered. At midday, he stood up to stretch and walked over to the glass wall of the reading room. He observed Running Water through the window. She had not taken a break. She had already completed her column headings for all 8 quarters of the 2-year review period. Now she was working steadily through the first BIA disbursement ledger. Sosi watched her left hand. She was moving her index finger down each entry line in the heavy book, while her right hand transcribed the figures onto her own sheets. Her finger glided down the column of payee account numbers and disbursement amounts. She did not stop to sound out the numbers. She did not pause to verify. She read figures the way Sosi did, absorbing the entire string of numerals as a single, recognizable word. She was moving fast. too fast. An hour later, a young clerk from the office messenger pool dropped a folded slip of paper onto Tsosi's desk. Tsosi opened it. It was a note from Running Water, written in her perfectly legible, upright script. Mr. Tsosi, has the flat file access request been routed? D. Running Water. Tsosi took his fountain pen and wrote his reply directly beneath her inquiry. Miss Running Water, the request is currently with the Deputy Director's office. It should be processed by the end of the week. R. Tsosi. He handed the note back to the messenger. It was a technically defensible statement, but it stretched the standard processing time by 3 full days. He watched the messenger carry the note back into the reading room. Through the glass, he saw Running Water read the reply, fold the paper, and place it neatly at the corner of her desk. She immediately returned to her ledger. She did not look out the window at him. She doesn't waste time, does she? Tsosi flinched internally, but kept his physical posture relaxed. He turned to see Gloria Atsidi standing beside his desk. Atsidi had worked in the BIA records room for 11 years. She was a soft-spoken Navajo woman who brought her lunch in a blue thermos every day and knew the exact location of every misfiled document in the building. She noticed when the rhythm of the office changed, and she noticed when things were out of place. Atsidi held out a manila folder. Misfiled allotment transfer, she said. Someone put a McKinley County parcel into the San Juan stack. Needs your correction stamp. Tsosi took the folder. Thank you, Gloria. I'll fix the routing. Atsidi lingered for a moment, her eyes drifting toward the glass wall of the reading room. The auditor seems to be working quickly, she noted. She looked back at Tsosi, her expression mild but observant. Is the San Juan Basin reconciliation a standard review, Raymond, or are they looking for something specific? The question hung in the air. Atsidi was not an investigator, but her institutional memory was flawless. If she began to suspect an irregularity, she would start remembering things, like who had accessed which cabinets and when. It is standard, Tsosi said, his voice projecting a mild bureaucratic boredom. The tribal council is just updating their internal baseline for the new fiscal year. Routine accountability. Atsidi nodded slowly. Good, she said. She turned and walked back to her own desk without pressing further. Tsosi watched her go, a cold bead of sweat forming at his hairline. The perimeter was shrinking. The afternoon dragged on with agonizing slowness. The heavy clatter of typewriters from the main floor provided a constant, chaotic soundtrack to Tsosi's mounting dread. At 4:45, the typewriters began to fall silent. The clerks were packing up. Inside the reading room, Running Water closed the heavy BIA disbursement ledger. She capped her pencil, aligned her ruler with the edge of her own ledger sheets, and carefully placed everything back into her canvas satchel. She buckled the leather straps and walked out of the glass enclosure. On her way to the main exit, she stopped at Tsosi's desk. "Thank you for your assistance today, Mr. Tsosi," she said. Her voice carried no particular emphasis, no hint of frustration regarding the delayed flat files. "You are welcome, Miss Running Water. Have a good evening." She adjusted the strap of her satchel. "A point of clarification, if you don't mind. The original transfer authorization documents for the parcels, the forms that legally mandate the payee accounts, are they filed separately in the General Archive, or are they kept together with the cadastral flat files?" Tsosi felt the air leave his lungs, though he maintained his polite, attentive expression. She was already looking past the maps. She understood the architecture of the fraud without even knowing it existed yet. A map only showed the parcel number. A disbursement ledger only showed where the money went. To connect the two, to prove an illegal diversion, an auditor needed the transfer authorization document. "They are kept together," Tsosi said. It was the truth. The transfer authorizations are clipped to the interior folders within the flat file cabinet. Your access request will cover them. "Excellent," Running Water said. "That will save time. I will see you in the morning." Tsosi watched her walk down the corridor and disappear through the heavy glass doors of the main entrance. He remained at his desk as the office slowly emptied around him. The chatter of departing clerks faded, replaced by the hollow, echoing silence of the federal building after hours. When he was entirely alone, Sosi stood up and walked into the reading room. The yellow fluorescent light was still on. He walked over to the table and opened the BIA disbursement ledger that Running Water had been working from. He turned the heavy, oversized pages, scanning the dates until he reached the quarter from 14 months ago. He found the entry. It was buried in a long column of routine tribal royalty payouts. Parcel reference 44-B-7. But the payee listed beside it was not Navajo tribal account 7741. The payee was listed as Coronado Land Services. Sosi stared at the ink. He read the Coronado Land Services entry exactly the way Running Water's finger would read it in 2 days. To a casual observer, it was just another corporate subcontractor. But to an auditor reconciling the tribal baseline, it would stand out like a flare in the dark. The tribal council did not use intermediary escrow companies for standard mineral royalties in the San Juan Basin. Running Water would see the name, she would see the diverted funds, and she would know it was an anomaly. And once she found the anomaly in the ledger, she would demand the map to verify the parcel number. Sosi closed the ledger. He left the reading room and walked down the main aisle of the archive, heading toward the flat file room under the pretext of refiling a stack of loose documents he carried in his left hand. The archive was dim, lit only by the emergency corridor bulbs. He reached the San Juan Basin cabinet. He set his decoy documents on top of the unit and reached into his pocket, retrieving his heavy brass records room key. He inserted it into the lock cylinder and turned. The mechanism disengaged with a heavy, satisfying click. Sosi gripped the brass pull and opened the drawer. The resistance of the flat file cabinet drawer was distinct, a soft metallic drag of the heavy steel rollers, followed immediately by the shifting weight of the thick, rolled cadastral maps inside. The smell of old paper and drafting dust rose from the open drawer. He reached in and carefully unrolled the original cadastral map for the affected parcel block. He did not need to turn on the overhead light. The ambient glow from the hallway was enough for him to find what he was looking for. He traced his finger over the intricate, hand-drawn topography, the carefully inked boundary lines, until he found parcel 44B7. 14 months ago, Harold Spence had called Sosi into his office. Spence had placed a file on the desk, a file containing undeniable proof that Sosi had falsified a minor grazing allotment record to protect his uncle's herd from a federal reduction mandate. It was a small crime, a crime of family loyalty, but it was enough to end Sosi's career and send him to federal prison. Spence had smiled, his silver hair catching the light, and offered a trade. Sosi would alter one digit on one map and one transfer document, redirecting the royalties of a single parcel to a company called Coronado Land Services. In exchange, the grazing allotment file would disappear. Sosi, trapped and terrified, had complied. Now, Sosi stared at the map. He looked at the number 7 in the parcel reference. He had done the work himself, using a razor blade to gently scrape away the original ink of the number 1 and applying fresh India ink to draw the 7. He had matched the stroke weight and the color as best as he could. But looking at it now, the altered digit was visible to him as a scar. The ink was slightly too dark, the edge of the numeral slightly too sharp against the faded 20-year-old drafting around it. He knew that a stranger glancing at the map would never notice it, but Della Running Water was not a stranger glancing at a map. She was an auditor who would compare this specific number against the transfer document, looking for a reason why the money was flowing to Santa Fe instead of Window Rock. The inconsistency would not survive her magnifying glass. Sosi let the heavy paper roll back onto itself. He pushed the drawer closed, listening to the soft metallic drag until the latch clicked. He turned the key, locking the cabinet once more. He turned off the single overhead bulb he had switched on in the flat file room and stepped out into the dark hallway. The building was entirely silent now, save for the distant, muffled sound of traffic on 4th Street. Sosi stood in the shadows, his back against the cold steel of the cabinet. He closed his eyes. He thought about the secondary filing room, located 2 doors down the corridor. He thought about the cabinet in the back corner, the one holding the duplicate allotment folders that no one ever checked. 14 months ago, within a week of making the alteration, Sosi had taken an insurance policy. He had made a carbon copy of the original transfer authorization order, the order bearing Harold Spence's own initials in the approval field, authorizing the transaction before the alteration was made. He had hidden that carbon copy inside a duplicate folder. It was the only piece of paper in the entire Bureau of Indian Affairs that proved Spence was the architect of the fraud and that Sosi was merely the instrument. Sosi opened his eyes and looked down the dark hallway toward the secondary filing room. He could walk down there right now. He could retrieve the carbon copy, put it in his briefcase, and take it to the tribal council himself. He could end the anxiety. But if he produced the carbon copy, he would have to confess to the alteration. He would have to explain the blackmail, which meant confessing to the grazing allotment falsification. He would destroy Spence, but he would destroy himself in the process. Sosi stood in the dark for a long time, listening to his own breathing. He looked at the locked San Juan Basin cabinet, and then he looked toward the room where the carbon copy was hidden. He was not ready to use it yet. He turned away from the archive, picked up his briefcase from his desk, and walked out into the Albuquerque night, leaving the records room to the silence and the waiting numbers. The morning light in Albuquerque was already sharp and unforgiving by the time Raymond Sosi unlocked the secondary staff entrance to the Bureau of Indian Affairs building on 4th Street. It was Tuesday, the second day of the Tribal Council's reconciliation audit. The administrative corridors were hollow and silent, smelling faintly of floor wax, stale tobacco smoke, and the dry, acidic tang of aging paper. Sosi walked to the records room with the measured, unhurried gait of a man who had spent his entire adult life navigating the physical and procedural architecture of federal bureaucracy. He hung his brown sport coat on the wooden rack beside the door, smoothed his tie, and walked to his desk. Resting precisely in the center of his green ink blotter was a single sheet of internal BIA memorandum paper. Sosi stopped. He did not touch it immediately. He looked at the surrounding desks, all empty, and then at the glass-paneled door of the deputy director's office at the far end of the hall, which was dark. He looked back at the paper. It was a handwritten note from Harold Spence. Sosi picked it up by the edges. The handwriting was Spence's unmistakable script, heavy, slanted, pressing so hard into the paper that the words were nearly embossed on the reverse side. The instruction was brief and entirely unambiguous. It directed Sosi to keep Della Runningwater's flat file access request in processing through the end of the current week. It further instructed him to document a plausible procedural reason for the delay, citing interdepartmental routing or supervisor unavailability, and to place that justification in the official daily log. Sosi read the words 3 times, his breathing shallow in the quiet room. The instruction was verbal in its intent, the kind of quiet, off-the-record directive a supervisor gives a subordinate in the hallway or over a cup of coffee. But it was written, in fact. Spence had committed it to paper. A cold, creeping sensation moved up the back of Sosi's neck. In the 11 years he had worked in the records room, he had learned that men like Harold Spence did not write things down unless they were building a record. If the delay of the flat file access was ever questioned by the tribal council or the regional director, this note would not exist to protect Sosi. It would exist to prove that Sosi had been instructed to follow standard procedure, and that any deviation or excessive delay was the result of Sosi's own incompetence or malfeasance. The note was framed as an instruction, but it was designed as an alibi. Sosi's first instinct was to tear the paper into small, unreadable pieces and drop them into the metal wastebasket beside his desk. His hands actually moved to do it, but then he stopped. If he destroyed the note, he destroyed the only proof he had that Spence was actively managing the obstruction. Slowly, methodically, Tsosi folded the memorandum paper in half, and then in half again. He walked over to the coat rack, slipped his hand into the right pocket of his brown sport coat, and pushed the folded square of paper deep into the lining. He withdrew his hand and walked back to his desk. Throughout the morning, he would find himself reaching down to brush the outside of the pocket. The texture of the folded note against the fabric felt impossibly dense. He touched it twice before the office even opened, and each time the paper felt heavier than it should, a physical weight dragging at his side. At 8:30, the front desk receptionist routed Della Runningwater back to the records room. She arrived looking exactly as she had the day before, carrying the same heavy canvas satchel over her shoulder. She wore a simple dark skirt and a white blouse, her posture perfectly straight, her expression pleasant, but entirely unreadable. In one hand, she carried a blue metal thermos. "Good morning, Mr. Tsosi," she said, her voice even and quiet. "Good morning, Miss Runningwater," Tsosi replied, standing up behind his desk. "The reading room is unlocked for you." She nodded her thanks and walked past him into the glass-walled reading room. Tsosi watched her through the glass. She unpacked her satchel with the same methodical precision he had observed yesterday. Out came the pre-ruled ledger sheets, the wooden pencils, the small metal sharpener, and the heavy, black-bound quarterly disbursement ledgers he had provided her. She unscrewed the cap of her blue thermos and poured a small amount of coffee into the cup. Within minutes, the smell of Runningwater's coffee began to drift out of the reading room and mix with the dry, sterile air of the records room. It was a rich, dark, domestic smell, entirely incongruous with the tension Tsosi was carrying in his chest. It smelled like a kitchen at dawn, like a normal life. And it made the sterile government office feel suddenly, sharply claustrophobic. Tsosi sat at his desk and arranged his morning work queue, pretending to review a stack of allotment transfers. In reality, he was waiting. He was waiting for her to ask about the flat file access request. He had his lie prepared. He was ready to tell her that the paperwork was still on the deputy director's desk, that the routing was taking longer than expected due to a backlog in the supervisor's queue. He braced himself for her frustration, for the inevitable pushback of an auditor being stonewalled. But the question never came. An hour passed, then 2. Runningwater sat at the reading room table, her head bowed over the disbursement ledgers, her finger tracking slowly down the columns of figures. She did not look up. She did not signal for him. She simply worked. Her silence made Tsosi far more uneasy than if she had marched up to his desk and demanded the cadastral maps. A frustrated auditor was an auditor who was stuck. Runningwater was not stuck. Her silence indicated that she had found enough to work with in the materials she already possessed. She was building a documentary foundation, brick by brick, using only the disbursement ledgers. She did not need the original maps yet, because the ledgers themselves were telling her a story. At 10:15, Runningwater closed the ledger she was reading, capped her pencil, and stood up. She walked out of the reading room and approached Tsosi's desk. Tsosi's stomach tightened. Here it is, he thought, the flat files. Mr. Tsosi, she said gently, I find I need to cross-reference some of these disbursement entries. Could you please provide me with the payee registration records for the San Juan Basin District? Tsosi blinked, caught off guard. The payee register? Yes, Runningwater said. The internal file of approved payee names and account numbers for the royalty disbursements. I need to verify the routing codes against the ledger entries. Tsosi looked at her. Her face was a mask of polite, professional inquiry. The payee registration records were a standard BIA administrative file. They were not restricted, they did not require a supervisor's co-signature, and they were not part of the original cadastral archive. They were simply a mimeographed list of every individual, tribal entity, and corporate body authorized to receive a federal treasury check for mineral royalties. He could not deny her access to them. Denying access to a standard administrative register would require a documented procedural reason, a reason he could not fabricate on the spot without drawing immediate, glaring suspicion to himself. If he said the register was lost, she would know he was lying. If he said it was restricted, she would ask to see the federal statute restricting it. "Of course," Sosi said, his voice remarkably steady despite the sudden hammering of his heart. "I will pull the binders for you right now." He walked to the secondary archive shelves at the back of the room and located the heavy, canvas-bound binders containing the payee registers. He pulled the volume covering the San Juan Basin, feeling the rough texture of the canvas under his palms. He knew exactly what was in this binder. He knew what she was going to find. He carried it back to the reading room and set it on her table. "Thank you," she said, already opening the cover. Sosi retreated to his desk across the hallway. The BIA office had settled into the particular silence of a government building in the early afternoon, when the morning rush of public inquiries had faded and most of the staff were sequestered at their desks. In this heavy, suspended quiet, footsteps carried farther than expected. The clatter of a typewriter down the hall sounded like small arms fire, and Sosi learned to track exactly where Running Water was in her work by the subtle, shifting sounds she made. He sat frozen at his desk, listening. He could hear the brittle sound of the payee register pages turning. The register was printed on cheap, thin mimeograph paper, the ink faintly purple and prone to smudging, the edges of the pages beginning to curl from age and dry air. Swish. Pause. Swish. He watched her through the glass. She had her disbursement ledger open on her left and the payee register open on her right. She was cross-referencing the payee names against the account numbers in the ledger, and she was working through the register alphabetically. Sosi felt a cold bead of sweat slide down his ribs beneath his shirt. He knew the alphabet. He knew how fast she read. He watched her turn the pages for the A entries, then the B entries. She was going to reach the C entries before the morning was out. 14 months ago, under Harold Spence's direct coercion, Sosi had altered a single digit on a mineral rights transfer document. That alteration had redirected the royalty payments for a highly productive parcel of Navajo tribal land away from tribal account 7741. Instead, the BIA accounting office, following the altered document, had dutifully routed the quarterly disbursements to a newly registered corporate payee. The name of that payee was Coronado Land Services. Swish. Another brittle page turned. Sosi gripped the edges of his desk. He watched her finger trace down the column. He saw her hand stop. Running Water had found it. She was looking at the entry for Coronado Land Services. The entry in the mimeographed register showed a Santa Fe mailing address. More importantly, it showed a registration date that was exactly 14 months old, perfectly consistent with the date the transfer document had been altered. Sosi held his breath, waiting for her reaction. He expected her to frown. He expected her to look up, to call him over, to ask why a private land services company in Santa Fe was listed as the primary payee for a parcel of tribal trust land. She did none of those things. Running Water simply picked up her wooden pencil, aligned it with the pre-ruled column on her ledger sheet, and copied the entry down. Her face did not change. Her posture did not shift. She wrote the name, the address, and the registration date with the exact same steady, unhurried rhythm she had used to write down the tribal account numbers. When she finished, she turned the page and moved on to the D entries. Sosi exhaled slowly, his hands shaking. Her lack of visible reaction was not a sign that she had missed the anomaly. It was a sign of how deeply disciplined she was. She was not an amateur who gasped at a discrepancy. She was a professional auditor collecting data points. She had found the thread, and she was simply winding it around her spool, waiting to see where it led. At midday, the office emptied out as the staff took their staggered lunch breaks. Gloria Atsidi walked past Sosi's desk carrying her blue thermos, nodding to him on her way to the break room. Sosi remained at his desk. He had no appetite. A few minutes later, Running Water emerged from the reading room. She walked up to Tsosi's desk and stood there, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "Mr. Tsosi," she said. "Yes, Miss Runningwater." "I have a procedural question regarding the disbursement protocols," she said, her voice maintaining its calm conversational tone. "In the event that a parcel is subject to a dispute, or if there is a subcontractor managing the extraction logistics, are intermediary accounts or subcontractor payees documented by a separate authorization form?" Tsosi felt the floor drop out from under him. He looked at her, trying to keep his face perfectly blank. She was not asking a hypothetical question. She had seen Coronado Land Services. She knew it was not a tribal account. She was now asking for the specific piece of paper that legally justified a private company receiving tribal money. "Yes," Tsosi said, because lying about standard BIA procedure to an auditor was impossible. Any intermediary payee requires a separate administrative authorization form, signed by the regional director or the deputy director, explaining the necessity of the escrow or subcontract. "I see," Runningwater said. She offered a small, polite smile. "In that case, could you please amend my pending flat file access request? When the cadastral maps are finally approved for release, I would like you to include any intermediary authorization forms covering the San Juan Basin block in that retrieval." This was the moment Tsosi understood that the game was over. She had identified the Coronado Land Services entry as an anomaly requiring explanation. She knew the money was going to Santa Fe, and she was formally requesting the document that authorized it. The problem was, that document did not exist. Harold Spence had never generated an intermediary authorization form because doing so would have required submitting it to the regional director for review, which would have exposed the fraud immediately. The entire diversion relied on the altered digit on the transfer document slipping through the massive volume of BIA paperwork unnoticed. "I will add that to your request," Tsosi said, his voice hollow. "Thank you," Runningwater said. She turned and walked back into the reading room. Tsosi stood up. He felt a sudden, desperate need to move. He walked out of the records room, down the long, silent hallway, toward the deputy director's office. He touched his jacket pocket as he walked. The folded note was still there, heavy and dense. Harold Spence was sitting behind his large oak desk, eating a sandwich from a wax paper wrapper. The office was spacious, featuring a large window that looked out over 4th Street. On the wall behind Spence hung a framed photograph of Spence shaking hands with a New Mexico state senator, both men smiling broadly. Spence looked up as Tsosi closed the door behind him. "What is it, Raymond?" Spence asked, wiping his mouth with a paper napkin. He spoke in the measured, resonant cadence of a man who was entirely accustomed to being agreed with. He treated his position at the BIA not as a public trust, but as a career posting, a stepping stone to a higher federal appointment. "She found the payee register," Tsosi said, keeping his voice low. She cross-referenced the disbursements. She saw Coronado Land Services. Spence stopped wiping his mouth. He looked at Tsosi for a long moment, his pale blue eyes cold and calculating. Did she ask what it was? "She asked if intermediary accounts require a separate authorization form," Tsosi said. "She asked me to include any such forms for the San Juan Basin in her flat file request." Spence leaned back in his leather chair. He did not look panicked. He looked annoyed, as if Tsosi had brought him a minor scheduling conflict rather than the collapse of a federal felony. "There are no authorization forms for that block," Spence said smoothly. "You know that, Raymond." "I know that," Tsosi said, his voice trembling slightly. "But she doesn't, and when I can't produce them, she is going to flag the payments as unauthorized." Spence steepled his fingers beneath his chin. He stared at the photograph of himself on the wall for a few seconds, then looked back at Tsosi. "You will go back to the reading room," Spence instructed, his tone entirely conversational. "You will explain to Miss Runningwater that Coronado Land Services is an administrative escrow arrangement. Tell her it was established to hold disputed royalties in trust pending a cadastral resurvey. Tell her that because it is an internal administrative hold, It does not require a separate external authorization form. Sosie stared at him in disbelief. Mr. Spence, that isn't a real procedure. There is no such thing as an administrative escrow arrangement without a signed authorization. A competent auditor will know that is false. She is a tribal bookkeeper, Raymond, Spence said dismissively. She only knows what the BIA tells her. You will deliver the explanation exactly as I have given it to you. It will satisfy her long enough for the week to end. And if it doesn't? Spence's eyes narrowed, the polite veneer slipping just enough to reveal the absolute ruthlessness beneath it. Then you will have a very difficult time explaining why you altered a federal transfer document, won't you? Now go back to your desk. Sosie left the office. The walk back down the hallway felt twice as long as the walk there. He felt physically ill. He was being ordered to deliver a transparent lie to a woman who had already proven herself to be meticulous, patient, and highly observant. He entered the records room and walked straight to the reading room door. He opened it. Runningwater looked up from her ledgers. Miss Runningwater, Sosie said. His mouth was dry. He had to force the words out. I spoke with the Deputy Director's office regarding your request for the intermediary authorization forms. Yes, she said, her pencil poised over her paper. I was informed that no such forms exist for the San Juan Basin block, Sosie said, reciting Spence's lie word for word. The Coronado Land Services account is an administrative escrow arrangement. It was established internally to hold royalties in trust pending a cadastral resurvey. Because it is an internal administrative hold, it does not require a separate authorization form. Runningwater did not blink. She did not argue. She simply lowered her pencil to the paper and began to write. Sosie watched in agony as she transcribed his exact words into her ledger notes. She wrote, administrative escrow arrangement. She wrote, pending cadastral resurvey. She documented the lie with the same terrifying precision she used to document the numbers. When she finished writing, she looked up at him. Could you spell the exact name of that administrative procedure for me, Mr. Sosie? She asked. Her voice was perfectly polite. I want to ensure I reference it correctly in my report to the council. Sosie froze. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He could not spell it. He could not spell it because the procedure did not formally exist in any BIA manual. And if he spelled it out for her official report, he would be cementing his own complicity in the fabrication. His mind raced, trying to find a way to deflect the question, but the silence stretched on for 1 second, then 2, then 3. His hesitation was glaring. It was a massive structural failure in his professional demeanor. Runningwater watched him. For the first time since she had arrived in Albuquerque, the polite, unreadable mask slipped. A look of profound, quiet understanding settled into her eyes. She registered the hesitation. She saw the lie for exactly what it was. She did not press him. She simply nodded slowly, made a small, silent mark in the margin of her ledger, and looked back down at her papers. Thank you, Mr. Sosie, she said softly. That will be all. Sosie backed out of the reading room, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had just handed her the rope she needed to hang him. He had barely returned to his desk when Gloria Atsidi walked into the records room, carrying a tall stack of manila folders she had just finished refiling in the secondary archive. Gloria had worked in the records room for 11 years, exactly as long as Sosie. She was soft-spoken but incredibly direct, a woman who knew where every single piece of paper in the building was supposed to be and who noticed immediately when anything was out of place. She paused by the open door of the reading room to exchange a few pleasantries with Runningwater. Sosie, standing by his desk across the room, pretended to sort his mail, but he strained to listen. Making good progress, Stella? Atsidi asked, shifting the heavy stack of folders on her hip. Steady progress, Gloria, Runningwater replied. The ledgers are very well maintained. Well, Raymond keeps a tight ship, Atsidi said with a small smile. She glanced toward the back of the room. Though I will say, those San Juan Basin files have been surprisingly active lately. Usually that block gathers dust for years. It was a casual remark, a piece of idle office observation from a woman whose entire professional life consisted of tracking the movement of paper. But Running Water did not treat it as a casual remark. Sosie saw Running Water's posture change instantly. She sat up straighter, her eyes locking onto Atsidi. "Active?" Running Water asked, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "Who else has accessed the San Juan Basin files recently?" Atsidi blinked, slightly taken aback by the sudden intensity of the question. She adjusted her glasses. "Oh, I don't have that off the top of my head. It's just a feeling you get when you work the room, you know?" Folders not quite settled in their tracks, dust disturbed on the cabinet handles. "Is there a way to verify who accessed them?" Running Water pressed, her tone polite but unyielding. "Well, certainly," Atsidi said, gesturing vaguely toward the front desk. "The flat file cabinet access log. Anyone who pulls an original cadastral map has to sign it out. The log would show exactly who opened the cabinet and when." Sosie stopped breathing. He stood perfectly still by his desk, the stack of mail forgotten in his hands. The access log. 14 months ago, when he had made the alteration, he had signed out the key and logged his access to the San Juan Basin cabinet. And just yesterday, after Running Water had left for the day, he had opened the cabinet again to look at the altered map, logging his access a second time. He had 2 unexplained retrievals in that log. Retrievals that had no corresponding work orders, no routine administrative justification. "Thank you, Gloria," Running Water said. She picked up her pencil and wrote something down in her ledger. "That is very helpful to know." Atsidi nodded, oblivious to the bomb she had just detonated, and carried her folders away. Sosie sank into his chair. The particular silence of the government office suddenly felt like the silence of a vacuum, sucking the air from his lungs. He pulled his desk drawer open and stared blindly at the neatly arranged pens and paper clips. He had to fix the log. He had to find a procedural way to amend or explain those entries before she requested it. His mind worked frantically, running through the BIA administrative protocols. Could he generate a backdated work order? No. The sequential numbering system would flag it immediately. A work order from 14 months ago would have a completely different prefix than the current batch. Could he claim he was doing routine preservation checks? No. Preservation checks were scheduled by the regional archivist, and there was no schedule on record for that quarter. Every solution he considered required creating a new, more visible irregularity. If he tried to alter the logbook itself, he would be committing a second, far more obvious forgery, one that Atsidi, who maintained the log, would spot instantly. There was no way out. The log was a permanent record of his presence at the scene of the crime. The afternoon dragged on with agonizing slowness. Sosie sat at his desk, paralyzed by the inevitable approach of 5 o'clock. In the reading room, Running Water continued to work, her pencil scratching steadily across the paper, the sound of it echoing in Sosie's mind like a countdown. At 4:45, Running Water closed her ledgers. She wiped her pencil sharpener clean with a small cloth, capped her thermos, and packed everything neatly into her canvas satchel. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, and walked out of the reading room. She did not stop at Sosie's desk. She did not say good evening. Instead, she walked directly to the front desk receptionist station in the main lobby. Sosie stood up and followed her at a distance, hovering near the doorway of the records room. He watched as Running Water pulled a formal, carbon-backed BIA request form from the public rack. She placed it on the counter and began to fill it out. She wrote steadily for 2 minutes, pressing hard so the carbon would transfer. When she was finished, she tore the pink copy off for her own records and placed the white original into the official internal routing out tray. She thanked the receptionist, turned, and walked out the glass front doors into the Albuquerque evening. Sosie waited until the receptionist turned her back to file some papers. Then, moving quickly, He walked over to the out tray and looked down at the white form Running Water had just deposited. It was a formal, written request for access to the flat file cabinet access log for the past 18 months. And it was not addressed to Raymond Sosi. It was addressed directly to the office of the Deputy Director, Harold Spence. Sosi stared at the form, the neat, precise handwriting spelling out the demand. The situation had just escalated beyond his control. By addressing the request to Spence, Running Water was bypassing the records room entirely. She was putting the demand on the official administrative record at the executive level. When Spence arrived in the morning and read this request, Spence would know that the simple delay tactic had failed. Spence would know that Running Water was actively hunting the access logs. Spence would know that the perimeter had been breached. Sosi turned away from the desk and walked back to the records room. He retrieved his brown sport coat from the rack. He slipped his arm into the sleeve, and his hand brushed against the right pocket. The folded note from Spence was still there. Sosi left the building at 5:15. He walked to his car, a faded green Ford sedan parked in the employee lot. The sun was beginning to set over the Sandia Mountains, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the city. The heat of the day was radiating up from the asphalt, but Sosi felt entirely cold. He started the car and pulled out of the lot. He was supposed to turn left onto 4th Street to head home to his small house in the North Valley. Instead, he turned right. He drove around the block and parked the Ford on the opposite side of the street, facing the BIA building. He turned off the engine and rolled down the window. The evening traffic hummed past him, the smell of exhaust mixing with the dry desert dust. Sosi sat in the driver's seat and looked up at the 4th floor of the building. The windows of the records room were dark. The windows of the public lobby were dark. But the two large windows at the corner of the building, the windows belonging to the office of Deputy Director Harold Spence, were blazing with light. Sosi gripped the steering wheel. He watched the illuminated rectangle of Spence's window against the darkening sky. He pictured Spence sitting behind his large oak desk, the framed photograph on the wall behind him. He pictured Spence realizing that the auditor was not a simple tribal bookkeeper who could be brushed off with a fabricated administrative term. He pictured Spence realizing that the access logs were going to point directly to Raymond Sosi. For 14 months, Sosi had lived in a state of chronic, low-grade anxiety. He had been afraid of exposure. He had been afraid of losing his job, his pension, his reputation as a man who never made clerical errors. He had been afraid of the tribal council finding out that he had stolen from them to protect his uncle's grazing allotment. But as he sat in the darkening car, watching the lights burn in the deputy director's office, the anxiety crystallized into something entirely different. It was the first time Sosi realized he was frightened of Harold Spence. He was not just afraid of getting caught anymore. He was afraid of the man who had ordered the crime. Spence was a man who wrote down illegal instructions to build an alibi. Spence was a man who invented fake procedures without blinking. Spence was a man who had the institutional authority to crush anyone who threatened his career. And right now, Spence was sitting in that lighted office, looking at a collapsing perimeter and calculating exactly how to ensure that when the walls finally fell, they fell only on Raymond Sosi. The distinction between anxiety and true fear mattered to Sosi. Anxiety was a paralyzing force. It made a man freeze, made him hide, made him hope the problem would simply go away. Fear was different. Fear was a survival mechanism. Fear demanded action. Sosi reached into his jacket pocket one last time. He pulled out the folded piece of memorandum paper. He ran his thumb over the heavy, slanted handwriting. He looked up at the lights on the 4th floor, his jaw setting into a hard, rigid line. He did not know what Spence was planning to do tomorrow, but as he started the car and pulled away from the curb, leaving the BIA building behind in the Albuquerque night, Sosi knew that the time for waiting was over. The numbers were closing in, and he was the only one who knew where the bodies were buried in the paper. The morning arrived with the dry, baked heat typical of Albuquerque. But inside the Bureau of Indian Affairs regional office on 4th Street, the atmosphere remained perpetually suspended in a cool, institutional stillness. Raymond Sosi stepped through the heavy glass doors at exactly 7:45, his brown sport coat sitting squarely on his shoulders, his face a mask of practiced, quiet precision. He walked the familiar route to the records room, his footsteps muffled by the thick, industrial linoleum that lined the corridors. For 14 months, Sosi had navigated this building with the hyper-vigilance of a man walking through a minefield. But over the past 3 days, that vigilance had sharpened into a singular, agonizing focus on Della Runningwater and her canvas satchel. Sosi reached his desk, a model of clerical order. His pens were aligned, his date stamp was perfectly centered on its ink pad. He looked at his in-tray. Sitting precisely on top of the morning's routing stack was the flat file access request form he had submitted to Harold Spence's office. Sosi picked up the paper. It was signed. Approved. Effective immediately. He stared at the sharp, slanted strokes of Spence's signature in the approval box. The ink was dark and final. This was not what Sosi had expected. He had buried the request at the bottom of Spence's tray, relying on the deputy director's natural administrative lethargy and their unspoken conspiracy of delay to keep the original cadastral maps out of Runningwater's hands for at least another week. A standard procedural delay was defensible. It was the lifeblood of the BIA. But the speed of this approval, returned almost instantly, bypassing the usual bureaucratic friction, sent a cold, heavy dread settling into the base of Sosi's stomach. Spence had decided that delay was no longer in his interest. Sosi understood the mechanics of power within the Bureau well enough to know what that meant. When a man like Harold Spence stopped stalling and started facilitating, it was not out of a sudden commitment to transparency. It meant the strategy had shifted. It meant Spence had built his firewall, and he was now opening the gates to let the fire burn exactly where he wanted it to. The plan had moved to a new phase, one in which Sosi's continued obstruction would only make Sosi look guilty, while Spence's prompt approval would make Spence look like a cooperative administrator. Folding the approved form with precise mechanical movements, Sosi walked down the hall toward the document reading room. As he passed the outer administrative office, the faint, sharp smell of ammonia drifted through the ventilation grate. The mimeograph machine was already running its early batch of daily circulars, the rhythmic thwack hiss of the drum pushing the chemical scent into the corridor. It was a smell Sosi usually associated with the mundane rhythm of government work, but today it smelled like a hospital ward, sterile and unforgiving. Della Runningwater was already at her reading room table when Sosi arrived. She sat with her back straight, her canvas satchel resting on the floor beside her chair. Her pre-ruled ledger sheets were spread across the wooden surface, the columns of numbers marching down the pages in her immaculate, unwavering hand. She did not look up immediately as Sosi entered, finishing a notation before capping her pen and resting it parallel to the paper. Sosi stepped forward and placed the approved access form on the edge of her table. Runningwater looked at the form. She did not express surprise. She did not offer a tight smile of victory, or make any comment about the sudden acceleration of the bureaucratic machinery. She simply accepted the paper, her eyes scanning the signature and the date stamp. "Thank you, Mr. Sosi," she said, her voice carrying the same methodical, patient cadence it always did. "I would like you to take me to the flat file room now, please." She did not ask to go at the end of the morning. She did not ask to schedule a time. She had already prepared her materials the night before, anticipating this exact outcome. She stood, smoothing the front of her skirt, and picked up her ledger and a small leather-bound case from her satchel. Sosi nodded, his throat tight. "Follow me." They walked in silence back down the corridor, past the rows of filing cabinets that housed the history of Navajo land rights, mineral leases, and grazing allotments. Sosi retrieved his heavy brass keyring from his pocket. They reached the reinforced door of the flat file archive, a room kept deliberately dim to protect the aging paper and linen of the original survey maps. Sosie unlocked the door and flipped the heavy toggle switch on the wall. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered, hummed, and finally caught, casting a harsh, pale glare over the massive steel cabinets that dominated the space. He walked to the cabinet labeled San Juan Basin, Cadastral Originals. He inserted a smaller key into the lock mechanism of the wide, shallow drawer. It turned with a heavy, metallic clack. Sosie pulled the drawer open. The scent of old drafting graphite, aged linen, and trapped dust rose into the air. He carefully slid his hands under the large, stiff sheet of the original cadastral map for the parcel block and lifted it free. He carried it to the reading room light table, a specialized piece of equipment designed for examining fine lines on survey documents. It consisted of a large pane of frosted glass with a powerful fluorescent tube mounted directly beneath it. Sosie laid the map flat on the glass and reached beneath the table to engage the light. The cold white light flared upward, illuminating the map from below. The effect was immediate and stark. The frosted glass diffused the glare, but the intense backlighting made everything on the surface of the map look simultaneously clear and forensic. The hand-drawn property lines, the topographical hash marks, and the carefully inked parcel reference numbers stood out with absolute, undeniable clarity. Every hesitation of the draftsman's pen, every variation in the density of the ink, was exposed. It was the first time Sosie had stood over this specific map with someone who was looking at the exact same thing he was looking at, with full knowledge of what to look for. Running Water stepped up to the light table. She placed her disbursement ledger sheet directly beside the illuminated cadastral map. She did not hesitate. She placed her index finger on the first line of her ledger and her other index finger on the corresponding parcel block on the map. Parcel reference 4209, Running Water read aloud, her voice a steady, rhythmic instrument in the quiet room. Sosie looked at the map. 4209. Match. Parcel reference 4210. 4210. Match. They moved down the column. The process was agonizingly slow, a deliberate march toward the precipice. Running Water's finger glided down her ledger, reading the numbers she had meticulously copied from the BIA's quarterly disbursement records, the records that dictated where the mineral royalty money actually went. Sosie's eyes followed her finger on the map, confirming the hand-inked notations that established the legal reality of the land. Parcel reference 4215. 4215. Match. Sosie's breath grew shallow. He could feel the pulse beating in his neck, a rapid, fluttering rhythm that felt entirely disconnected from his quiet, motionless exterior. They were 3 lines away. 2 lines away. Parcel reference 4218. 4218. Match. Running Water moved her finger down one more line in her ledger. This was the entry for the parcel whose royalties were being diverted to Coronado Land Services. This was the entry Sosie had altered 14 months ago, sitting alone in this very room, his hand shaking as Harold Spence's threat echoed in his mind. Parcel reference 4221, Running Water read. Sosie looked down at the map, at the specific block of land illuminated by the cold white light. He looked at the number written there, the number he had scraped with a razor blade and re-inked. The number on the map was 4227. The numbers did not match. The silence that fell over the reading room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that follows the snapping of a structural beam before the roof caves in. Sosie stared at the illuminated digit. The 7 seemed to vibrate under the fluorescent glare. Both of them knew exactly what had just happened. The disbursement ledger, which paid Coronado Land Services, was operating on a parcel reference that did not align with the original cadastral reality. Running Water did not look up at Sosie. She did not gasp, nor did she demand an immediate explanation. Her expression remained entirely neutral, her focus locked on the paper. She opened the small, leather-bound case she had taken from her satchel and extracted a heavy, brass-rimmed magnifying glass. She leaned over the light table. The sound of the magnifying glass being set down on the frosted glass of the light table was a soft, precise click. In the dead quiet of the archive room, the sound carried more weight than it should have. It was the sound of a lock tumbling into place. Running water peered through the lens, moving it slowly over the altered digit. The backlighting from the table pushed through the paper, revealing the microscopic damage to the linen fibers where Tsosi had carefully scraped away the original 1 to make room for the 7. The ink color, Running Water noted aloud, speaking to the map rather than to Tsosi, her voice perfectly level, is a half-shade darker than the surrounding entries. The stroke weight on the descending line of the 7 is heavier. It does not match the draftsman's pressure on the adjacent numerals. Tsosi said nothing. There was nothing to say. The physical evidence was screaming under the magnifying glass. He stood, paralyzed, his hands resting on the edge of the metal table, feeling the cold steel bite into his palms. Running Water straightened up. She lowered the magnifying glass, but did not put it away. Finally, she turned her head and looked directly at Tsosi. Her dark eyes were calm, analytical, and entirely devoid of malice. That lack of anger was somehow worse than if she had shouted at him. It meant she was not taking this personally. She was simply processing a critical anomaly in the data. "Mr. Tsosi," she said quietly, "I will need you to retrieve the original transfer authorization document for this specific parcel. I need to compare the reference number on the transfer order against the map." Tsosi swallowed hard. "I will get it." He stepped away from the light table, his legs feeling hollow, as if the bones had been replaced with dry reeds. He walked out of the flat file room and down the hall to the primary records room. He moved like a ghost through the aisles of filing cabinets, navigating by pure muscle memory. He found the transfer file for the San Juan Basin block. He pulled the heavy manila folder, opened it, and extracted the original transfer authorization document, the piece of paper that legally moved the mineral rights and dictated the royalty flow. He carried the document back to the flat file room. He handed it to Running Water. She took it and placed it on the light table, right next to the illuminated cadastral map. She leaned over, her eyes moving rapidly between the two documents. Tsosi watched her, knowing exactly what she was seeing. The parcel reference number typed on the transfer authorization document was 4227. It matched the altered number on the map. It did not match the original sequence. The implication was devastating in its clarity. If the map had simply been wrong from the beginning, the transfer document would have matched the original error. But because the transfer document matched the altered ink, it meant only one thing. The original, sacred cadastral map had been retroactively altered to match a fraudulent transfer document. The map had been mutilated to hide the crime. Running Water picked up her pen. She made a single, precise notation in her ledger. She closed the ledger, the heavy covers coming together with a dull thud. She placed her pen and her magnifying glass back into her satchel and fastened the brass buckles. "Thank you for your assistance this morning, Mr. Tsosi," she said, lifting the satchel by its canvas strap. "I have what I need from the map for now." She paused near the doorway, turning back to look at him one last time. "I will need to speak with Gloria at CD about the flat file access log this afternoon," Running Water said. She did not accuse him of making the alteration. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask him why the ink was wrong or why the numbers were mismatched. Her very calmness was a weapon, slicing through the bureaucratic fog. It told Tsosi with absolute certainty that she was past the point of uncertainty. She was no longer investigating a discrepancy. She was building a documented record of fraud. And she knew exactly where the next piece of evidence was located. Tsosi watched her walk away, her sensible shoes clicking softly against the linoleum. He remained standing over the light table for a long time, staring down at the number he had forged, bathed in the cold white light. Eventually, he turned off the table, returned the map to its drawer, locked the cabinet, and walked back to his desk in the main records room. The office was beginning to hum with mid-morning activity. Typewriters clattered in the distance, telephones rang. Sosi sat down in his chair and looked at his work queue. Resting in the center of his blotter, delivered by the internal mail clerk while he was in the archive room, was a new routing slip. It bore the letterhead of the deputy director's office. Sosi picked it up. It was an official assignment order, signed by Harold Spence. It directed Raymond Sosi to report to the Agricultural Leasing Department on the second floor, beginning the following morning, to conduct a comprehensive records audit of historical grazing permits. The assignment was slated to last 3 weeks. Sosi read the slip twice. The Agricultural Leasing Department was in a different wing of the building. The assignment would remove him entirely from the records room. It would remove him from the flat file archives. Most importantly, it would remove him from Della Running Water. The timing made the purpose blindingly clear. Spence was not just accelerating the process, he was isolating the variables. By removing Sosi from the records room, Spence was ensuring that Sosi could no longer monitor Running Water's progress, could no longer intercept documents, and could no longer defend himself when the inevitable questions arose. Sosi was being placed in a holding pen, out of sight, while the machinery of his destruction was assembled. The rest of the day passed in a blur of agonizing, slow-motion dread. Sosi processed his routine paperwork with mechanical efficiency, his hands moving while his mind raced through a labyrinth of closing walls. He watched Gloria Atsidi working at her desk across the room, knowing that at some point this afternoon, Running Water was going to ask her for the access log. He knew what the log contained. 2 unexplained retrievals of the San Juan Basin files, signed out under Sosi's unique identification code, with no corresponding work orders. By 5 o'clock, the office began to empty. The clatter of typewriters ceased. The mimeograph machine was finally shut down, though the smell of ammonia lingered in the stagnant air. The staff packed their briefcases and filed out into the Albuquerque evening. Gloria Atsidi washed her blue thermos in the break room sink, said a quiet goodnight to Sosi, and left. Sosi remained at his desk. He waited until the silence in the building was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the air conditioning units and the occasional settling of the old structure. He stood up. He picked up a completed requisition form from his out tray, a flimsy, transparent pretext, and walked out of the records room. He headed toward the executive wing, toward the office of the deputy regional director. The corridor was dim, the overhead lights operating on their reduced evening cycle. Sosi reached Spence's office. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar. Sosi knocked softly. "Mr. Spence?" There was no answer. Sosi pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was empty. Spence had already left for the day. But the room was not dark. The heavy brass desk lamp on Spence's immaculate mahogany desk was turned on, casting a warm, concentrated pool of yellow light across the leather blotter. Sosi approached the desk, intending to leave the requisition form and retreat. But as he reached the edge of the mahogany, his eyes fell upon a document resting perfectly centered under the pool of light. It was a draft memorandum. Sosi did not want to read it, but his eyes were already pulling the words from the page. He leaned in closer. The texture of the paper was immediately apparent. It was not the cheap, thin paper used for daily circulars or requisition forms. It was standard government bond stock, heavy and slightly textured, with a high cotton content. It was the kind of paper the Bureau of Indian Affairs used for documents of permanent historical or administrative significance. It was paper meant to be kept in a file for decades. The memorandum was addressed to Owen Pratt, the BIA regional director. The subject line read, "Irregularities in cadastral archive access and potential record alteration." Sosi's breath caught in his throat. He read the memo from beginning to end, his eyes tracking the careful, measured type. It was written in the flawless, passive voice of official government correspondence. It did not express anger or accusation. It expressed deep administrative concern. It detailed how it had come to the attention of this office that an employee who had unsupervised access to original cadastral records appeared to have made unauthorized alterations to parcel reference numbers. It stated that these alterations appeared to have been made for personal reasons or potential financial gain. Then, Sosi saw his own name. A review of the flat file access logs indicates that Raymond Sosi, records clerk, initiated 2 undocumented retrievals of the San Juan Basin cadastral maps outside of normal procedural work orders. These retrievals align with the time frame of the suspected alterations. Sosi read the paragraph again. The trap was perfectly constructed. Spence had taken the very access logs that Running Water was currently investigating and weaponized them. He was preempting the auditor's findings. By the time Running Water brought her evidence to the regional director, Spence would have already framed the narrative. Sosi was a rogue employee acting alone, and Spence was the diligent supervisor who had uncovered the breach. Sosi looked at the date typed at the top of the memo. It was dated 2 days ago. Spence had written this before Running Water had even found the altered digit. He had been holding it, waiting for the exact right moment to submit it. The memo was almost ready. It lacked only a final signature. Sosi scanned the entire document, searching for any mention of Coronado Land Services. There was none. He searched for any mention of the transfer authorization that had initiated the diversion. There was none. Most importantly, he searched for Harold Spence's name. Spence's name did not appear anywhere in the text of the document. It existed only at the very bottom, beneath a blank line, as the signatory. Spence had completely insulated himself. He was a ghost in his own machine. Sosi stood in the quiet office, the yellow light of the desk lamp reflecting off the heavy bond paper. The fear that had crystallized in his car the night before now hardened into something cold and sharp. He was looking at his own professional and personal execution, typed neatly on government stationery. He reached out and carefully adjusted the memo, ensuring it sat exactly as he had found it, perfectly aligned with the edges of the leather blotter. He picked up his pretext requisition form and placed it in Spence's in-tray. He turned to leave. As he stepped away from the desk, he reached out and clicked the rotary switch on the brass desk lamp. The light snapped off. The office was plunged into heavy shadows, illuminated only by the ambient light bleeding in from the corridor. Sosi took one step toward the door, and then he froze. His mind, suddenly operating with the hyper-clarity of a hunted animal, processed a microscopic detail. Spence had left the office. Spence was a man of fastidious, almost obsessive habits. Spence did not leave desk lamps on by accident. If Spence returned in the morning and found the lamp turned off, he would know someone had been in his office. He would know someone had stood at his desk. He would know Sosi had seen the memo. Sosi turned back. He reached into the darkness, his fingers brushing the warm brass of the lamp housing. He found the rotary switch. Click. The yellow pool of light flooded the desk once more, illuminating the draft memo exactly as it had been. Sosi stared at the lamp. The small, deliberate act of turning it back on was a profound crossing of a threshold. It was the moment he realized how precisely he was now thinking about evidence. He was no longer just a clerk trying to hide a mistake. He was a man engaged in a war of documentation, and he had just learned to cover his tracks. He backed out of Spence's office, pulling the heavy wooden door until it rested slightly ajar, exactly as he had found it. He walked down the corridor, moving away from the executive wing and deep into the secondary filing rooms. These were the archives of the archives, rooms filled with duplicate allotment folders, redundant carbon copies, and the bureaucratic detritus of decades of land management. The air here was stale, smelling of dry rot and old glue. Sosi walked to a specific row of olive-green steel cabinets in the far corner of the room. He stopped in front of the third cabinet from the wall. He did not need to look at the labels. He knew exactly what was inside the second drawer from the top. 14 months ago, within a week of making the alteration on the cadastral map, a profound sense of self-preservation had overridden his fear of Spence. He had taken the original transfer authorization order, the one that legally redirected the royalties to Coronado Land Services, and he had placed a sheet of carbon paper beneath it before Spence signed it. Spence had taken the original, but Sosi had kept the carbon copy. That carbon copy bore Harold Spence's initials in the approval field. It was the only piece of paper in existence that connected the deputy director directly to the fraudulent transaction. Sosi had hidden it inside a duplicate allotment folder for a deceased grazing leaseholder, burying it in a cabinet that hadn't been audited in 10 years. It was his insurance policy, a piece of leverage he had prayed he would never have to use. Sosi reached out and placed his hand on the cool metal handle of the drawer. He stood there in the dim light of the secondary archive. He did not pull the handle. He did not open the drawer yet. He just let his hand rest on the steel, feeling the solid reality of the cabinet. He thought about Della Runningwater, calmly packing her magnifying glass, building her undeniable chain of evidence. He thought about Harold Spence, sitting somewhere in the city, confident that his meticulously typed memorandum was going to solve all his problems. He thought about the numbers on the map, the altered ink, the heavy bond paper on the mahogany desk. Sosi remained perfectly still, his hand gripping the drawer handle, listening to the silence of the building. He stood there for a long time, weighing the gravity of what he was about to do, until the building's automatic corridor lights, governed by a mechanical timer in the basement, finally clicked loudly and switched off for the night, plunging the archive room into absolute, impenetrable darkness. The records room of the Bureau of Indian Affairs at 8 in the morning was usually defined by a comforting, predictable rhythm. It was a symphony of minor administrative noises, the sliding of heavy steel drawers, the rhythmic thud of the date stamp, and the low hum of the fluorescent lights warming up against the chill of the Albuquerque morning. But on this particular morning, the room was defined entirely by an absence. Gloria Atsidi arrived at 10 minutes to 8, carrying her blue thermos of coffee, and immediately felt the imbalance in the room. Raymond Sosi's desk was empty. His in-tray was completely undisturbed, the stack of pending allotment transfers sitting exactly where the mail clerk had placed them the previous afternoon. Sosi was a man of rigid, almost punishing punctuality. In 11 years of working together, Atsidi had never known him to be late, and she had certainly never known him to be absent without prior notice. She walked past his desk and paused. The silence of his workstation was profound. It was a highly specific silence, the sound of Sosi's empty chair. The heavy wooden chair had a slightly loose caster on the front left leg, a mechanical flaw that clicked softly every time Sosi shifted his weight to reach for a file or answer the telephone. It was a noise so constant it had become part of the room's baseline frequency. Its absence now was louder than a shout. Atsidi looked at the wall clock. It was exactly 8 o'clock. She walked to the front counter, opened the staff duty register, and waited 3 more minutes. When the minute hand ticked past the hour, she uncapped her fountain pen. She did not want to do it, but the procedures of the BIA were absolute. She wrote Sosi's name on the daily ledger and marked a sharp, definitive A in the attendance column. He had not called in. 1 floor above, at exactly 9 o'clock, Deputy Regional Director Harold Spence arrived at his office. He did not look at the photograph of himself with the state senator on his wall, nor did he pause to look out the window at the morning traffic on 4th Street. He went straight to his desk, unlocked the center drawer, and removed the draft memorandum he had finalized the previous evening. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic execution, written in the careful, passive voice of official correspondence. It detailed the discovery of unauthorized alterations to original cadastral records, noted the severe breach of protocol, and named Raymond Sosi as the sole employee with the unsupervised access and the troubled history necessary to commit the act. Spence read the document one last time. His own name did not appear anywhere in the text except at the bottom, hovering above the signature line. You took his heavy fountain pen, signed his name with a fluid, practiced motion, and slipped the memorandum into a red-bordered internal routing envelope. He walked out of his office and handed the envelope directly to the regional director's secretary. He stood there, projecting an air of solemn administrative duty, and watched as the secretary fed the routing slip into the mechanical time stamper. The machine engaged with a heavy, metallic clack, printing the date and time in purple ink across the top of the page. The memo was now formally part of the administrative record. The trap was set, the timeline was established, and Spence felt the tight knot of anxiety in his chest finally begin to loosen. Downstairs in the lobby, Della Runningwater walked through the double glass doors carrying her canvas satchel. She approached the main receptionist's desk to sign the visitor log, her demeanor as calm and methodical as it had been on her first day. She asked the receptionist to notify Raymond Tsosi that she was ready to resume her work in the reading room. The receptionist, a younger woman who managed the main switchboard, shook her head.
Mr. Tsosi won't be joining you today, Miss Runningwater. He called in absent about 20 minutes ago, said he was unwell.
Runningwater's expression did not change, though her mind immediately categorized the information. Tsosi had not mentioned feeling ill the previous afternoon. In fact, he had seemed entirely consumed by a quiet, vibrating tension. She did not view his absence as a coincidence. She viewed it as a data point.
I see,
Runningwater said, her voice perfectly level.
I still require access to the flat file room to complete my reconciliation. Is there another staff member who is authorized to serve as my document liaison?
I can route you to Miss Atsidi in the records room, the receptionist offered. She handles the primary archives when Raymond is out. Runningwater thanked her and walked down the corridor to the records room. She found Gloria Atsidi standing near the secondary filing cabinets, holding a stack of misfiled folders. Runningwater formally requested that Atsidi serve as her document contact for the day. Atsidi looked at the auditor. This was the moment her hidden conflict activated. For days, she had watched Tsosi unravel. She had noted the strange delays, the tension over the San Juan Basin files, and the fact that Tsosi had been accessing the flat file cabinet without a work order. She had held that information back, assuming Tsosi had some convoluted but ultimately harmless procedural reason for his actions. But Tsosi was not here to give his own account. He had abandoned his post. Atsidi looked at Tsosi's empty desk, then back to Runningwater. She nodded slowly.
I will assist you, Miss Runningwater. What do you need?
I need to review the flat file access log, Runningwater said directly. She did not ask for the cadastral maps yet. She went straight for the perimeter of the anomaly. Specifically, I need to know whether the log shows any retrievals of the San Juan Basin files outside of documented work orders in the past 18 months. Atsidi felt a cold prickle of inevitability at the base of her neck. The auditor already knew what question to ask. Atsidi walked to the secure cabinet near the back of the room and retrieved a heavy, oversized 3-ring binder. She carried it to the reading room table and set it down. The dry rasp of the flat file cabinet's access log binder sliding across the wood seemed unnaturally loud. The binder had a cracked spine, and the pages were stiff with age and heavy handling. Atsidi opened it with the care of someone who knows exactly what kind of damage the contents can do. She turned the stiff pages back through the months, scanning the columns of dates, times, and signatures. She stopped at a page from 14 months ago, and then another from earlier that same week.
There are 2 entries,
Atsidi said, her soft voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. She read them aloud.
14 months ago, on a Tuesday evening, Raymond Tsosi accessed the San Juan Basin flat file. And again, 3 days ago. Neither entry has a corresponding work order number listed in the authorization column.
Atsidi looked up, meeting Runningwater's eyes.
This is procedurally irregular. I noticed it at the time, but I assumed there was an explanation. Raymond does not make mistakes with the logs.
Runningwater opened her canvas satchel, withdrew her pre-ruled ledger sheets, and carefully copied both log entries into her notes, transcribing the dates and times with absolute precision. She did not gloat, nor did she act surprised. Could these entries have been made by anyone else? Runningwater asked. Could someone have used his sign-in credentials?
No,
Atsidi said firmly. Access to that specific room requires a staff identification card. It must be physically inserted into a mechanical slot reader mounted on the wall. The reader drops pins through a pattern of holes punched into the plastic. Each card is individually coded to a specific employee. The lock will not disengage, and the log will not record the entry without Raymond's physical card. There is no ambiguity about who made those retrievals. Thank you, Miss Atsidi, Running Water said. I would like to go into the flat file room now. Atsidi used her own coded card to unlock the heavy door to the archive. The room smelled of old paper, drafting graphite, and the faint, sharp tang of ammonia from blueprint copies. Running Water moved to the large light table in the center of the room. She had already pulled the original cadastral map for the San Juan Basin parcel block, and she laid it flat, smoothing the edges. Beside it, she placed her disbursement ledger and the original transfer authorization documents she had requested the day before. For the next 2 hours, Running Water worked in total silence. She completed her comparison of all 12 parcel reference numbers, moving her finger from the hand-inked cadastral map to the typed disbursement ledger, and finally to the transfer documents. 11 of the parcels matched perfectly. There was no discrepancy in their routing, no error in their numerals. The 12th parcel did not match. Running Water stared at the single digit on the map. The ink color and the stroke weight were wrong. It was a masterful forgery, but under the harsh glare of the light table, it was undeniably an alteration. She reached into her satchel and produced a sheet of translucent tracing paper and 2 colored pencils, one red, one blue. She laid the tracing paper over the original cadastral map and used the red pencil to carefully trace the exact shape, angle, and thickness of the altered numeral. Then she moved the tracing paper over the typed transfer document and used the blue pencil to trace the corresponding numeral directly over the red one. The resulting image was a stark, reproducible exhibit. The red lines of the map's digit and the blue lines of the transfer document's digit diverged sharply. It was a physical documentation of fraud that required no camera equipment, no specialized forensic tools. It was just geometry, captured on paper, proving that the map had been changed to match the document. While Running Water was finishing her tracing, Atsidi left the flat file room. She walked to the main regional filing banks, her mind working through the implications of what she had just witnessed. Tsosi had altered a map. Royalties were being diverted. But Tsosi did not have the authority to approve the creation of an intermediary payee account. Someone else had to have built the financial architecture to receive the stolen money. Atsidi pulled the heavy drawer labeled Intermediary Account Authorizations, Regional. She pulled the entire master file folder, a thick accordion envelope containing the approved paperwork for every subcontractor and escrow payee in the BIA's jurisdiction. She carried it back to the reading room. She had not been asked to do this. She was stepping far outside the boundaries of a simple document liaison. She walked up to the light table and set the thick file folder down beside Running Water's traced comparison sheet. Running Water looked at the folder, then at Atsidi. That is the intermediary account authorization file for the entire regional office, Atsidi said quietly. She opened the flap. I have checked it. The file contains no authorization for a company called Coronado Land Services. Atsidi said nothing further. She simply left the empty folder on the table and stepped back. The act of bringing it was her answer to the decision she had been weighing all morning. She had chosen the integrity of the record over the silence of the bureaucracy. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere in the BIA office had grown thick with unspoken tension. At 3 o'clock, the telephone on Atsidi's desk rang. It was the regional director's secretary, informing her that Deputy Director Spence wished to see her in his office immediately. Atsidi smoothed her skirt, walked up the stairs, and knocked on Spence's door. Come in, Gloria, Spence said. He was sitting behind his large mahogany desk, his hands steepled beneath his chin. He looked relaxed, the picture of a man who had already secured his perimeter. Close the door, please. Atsidi closed it and stood before the desk. I understand Raymond is absent today, Spence began, his voice carrying a tone of manufactured sympathy. "It is unfortunate, given the pressure he has been under. I also understand you have taken over as the liaison for the tribal auditor."
"Yes, sir,"
Atsidi said. "Miss Runningwater required access to the flat files." "Of course," Spence said smoothly. "Tell me, how is the auditor's work progressing?"
"It is nearly complete,"
Atsidi replied, keeping her voice entirely neutral. Spence's eyes locked onto hers, searching for a crack in her professional facade.
"Has she found anything that requires explanation? Any irregularities in the filing system?"
Atsidi looked at the photograph of the state senator on the wall, then back to Spence. She knew exactly what he was asking. He wanted to know if the blame had successfully been laid at Sosi's feet. He wanted her to confirm that the narrative he had constructed was holding together. "The auditor will have to speak for her own findings, Mr. Spence," Atsidi said. The silence in the office stretched thin and taut. Spence's relaxed posture vanished. His hands dropped to the desk. This was not the answer he wanted. It was not the deferential, gossipy report of a subordinate eager to please management. It was a wall. Spence's expression hardened, the silver-haired charm evaporating to reveal the cold calculation beneath. He knew, in that instant, that Atsidi had taken a side, and it was not his. "Very well, Gloria," Spence said, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "You may return to your desk. Ensure that all standard protocols are followed to the letter."
"Yes, sir,"
Atsidi said, and left the room. Hours later, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the Sandia Mountains. The heat of the Albuquerque day bled away into a cool, dry evening. Raymond Sosi did not drive home. He had spent the entire day driving aimlessly along the dusty roads at the edge of the city, his mind locked in a paralyzing loop of fear and calculation. He had seen Spence's memo. He knew the machinery of the federal government was already moving to crush him. At 7 o'clock, Sosi parked his car near a strip of closed storefronts 3 blocks from the BIA office. He walked to a standalone payphone booth on the corner. He stepped inside and pulled the heavy glass folding door shut. The booth smelled of hot metal, old cigarette smoke, and the dust of the highway. He picked up the receiver. The black plastic was faintly warm against his ear, a ghost of the previous caller. He dropped his coins into the slot and dialed the number for the Navajo Tribal Council office. The line rang 4 times before a heavy, deliberate voice answered. "Bigay?" Walter Bigay was still in his office. Sosi pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the booth. He spoke very quietly, his voice barely rising above the ambient hum of the streetlights outside. "Mr. Bigay, this is Raymond Sosi from the records room." There was a brief pause on the line. Bigay did not express surprise. "I know who you are, Raymond. Della Runningwater says you weren't at work today." "I wasn't," Sosi said. His throat felt like sandpaper. "Mr. Bigay, there is a document. I need to deliver it to the tribal council attorney before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. It concerns the Coronado Land Services payments." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with sudden, sharp attention. Bigay was an older man who had spent his life fighting the structural distrust of the BIA. He recognized the tone of a man who was finally ready to break ranks. "What kind of document, Raymond?" Bigay asked. "The kind that proves who actually authorized the theft," Sosi said. "I can't bring it to the BIA first. They will destroy it. I need your attorney there to take custody of it." "I will be at the BIA office at 8:30 tomorrow morning," Bigay said, his voice hard and decisive. "I will have Sylvia Morningstar with me. Do not be late, Raymond." "I won't be," Sosi said, and hung up the phone. Sosi drove back to his small house on the outskirts of the city. He walked through the dark living room and went straight to the kitchen. He did not turn on the main lights, only the single overhead bulb above the small Formica dining table. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a plain manila envelope. He had retrieved it the previous evening after finding Spence's routing slip. He had left the duplicate allotment folder buried in the secondary filing cabinet where it belonged, but he had taken the carbon copy home. It was the only thing keeping him from a federal prison sentence. Sosi sat down at the table, opened the envelope, and slid the carbon copy out. Under the harsh glare of the single bulb, the color of the document was striking. The text was a deep, slightly smeared blue-black, the distinct hallmark of heavy-grade carbon paper. He stared at the bottom right corner of the page. The initials in the authorization field, HS, were pressed harder into the paper than the surrounding text. They were indented, embossed into the fiber of the page, as if Spence had signed the original with more force than usual, perhaps driven by his own adrenaline at the moment of the theft. Sosi sat across from the piece of paper for an hour. He did not move. He listened to the wind rattling the loose screen on his kitchen window. He thought about his uncle's grazing allotment, the minor falsification he had made years ago to protect his family, the leverage Spence had used to turn him into a thief. He had spent 14 months living in quiet terror, trying to be invisible. But invisibility had not saved him. Spence had drafted the memo anyway. The only way out was through the fire. He folded his hands on the table and waited for the morning. Across town, in a modest motel room illuminated by the neon glow of a vacancy sign, Della Runningwater sat at a small desk. Her canvas satchel was open, her ledger sheets meticulously arranged in sequential order. She picked up the telephone on the nightstand and asked the operator to connect her to Walter Begay's home number. Begay answered on the first ring. He had just walked through his front door. "Walter," Runningwater said, her voice maintaining its usual calm, methodical cadence. She did not know that Sosi had called him less than 2 hours ago. "I have completed my comparative analysis." "Tell me what you have, Della," Begay said, sitting down heavily in his armchair. "I have documented a single-digit discrepancy in the parcel reference for the affected transfer," Runningwater explained, reading directly from her notes. "The original cadastral map was altered to match a fraudulent transfer document. I have traced the discrepancy. Furthermore, I have confirmed an unauthorized payee in the disbursement record, a company called Coronado Land Services, which possesses no intermediary account authorization in the regional files. Finally, I have secured the flat file access log. It shows 2 undocumented retrievals by the records clerk, Raymond Sosi, matching the timeline of the alteration." Begay listened to the methodical dismantling of the BIA's accounting. "You have the proof on paper?" "I have the ledger entries, the tracing, and the log transcripts," Runningwater confirmed. "I am ready to present my findings in the morning. However, given the nature of the alteration and the absence of the records clerk today, I believe this extends beyond a simple accounting error. I believe the tribal council should have its attorney present when I deliver this to the regional director." "Sylvia Morningstar will be with me," Begay said, a grim satisfaction creeping into his voice. "We will meet you at the BIA office at 8:30. Have your satchel ready, Della. We are going to tear their house down." Runningwater placed the receiver back on the cradle. She looked down at the traced red and blue lines on her desk. The numbers did not lie. They never did. She carefully packed the tracing paper into a rigid folder, placed it inside her satchel, and turned off the lamp. Tomorrow, the mathematics of the theft would be laid bare, and the bureaucracy that had hidden it would be forced to answer to the ledger. The morning sun over Albuquerque had already baked the chill out of the high desert air by the time Walter Begay parked his heavy sedan along 4th Street. It was 8:30 precisely. The Bureau of Indian Affairs regional office stood before him, a rigid structure of brick and glass that housed the administrative machinery of federal oversight. For decades, Begay had viewed this building as a necessary adversary, a place where the sovereignty of his people was translated into endless columns of federal ink. Today, however, he was not arriving to negotiate or to plead. He was arriving to dismantle. Beside him walked Sylvia Morningstar, the attorney retained by the tribal council. She carried a leather briefcase and wore a tailored suit that signaled her absolute fluency in the language of federal bureaucracy. She did not speak as they approached the glass double doors. She had already reviewed Della Runningwater's preliminary findings over a late-night telephone call, and her mind was entirely occupied with the procedural sequence of the morning ahead. They entered the lobby, bypassing the general reception desk, and took the elevator directly to the executive floor. The air here was climate-controlled and smelled faintly of ozone from the heavy copying machines down the hall. They approached the desk of the regional director's secretary, a formidable woman who guarded the inner sanctum with practiced efficiency. "Good morning," Begay said, his voice carrying the deep, resonant cadence of a man who had argued land claims in Washington. "I am Walter Begay, representing the Tribal Council. This is Sylvia Morningstar, our legal counsel. We are here to formally request an immediate meeting with Regional Director Pratt." The secretary looked up, her hands hovering over the keys of her typewriter. "Do you have an appointment, Mr. Begay? The director's schedule is quite full this morning." "We do not have an appointment," Morningstar interjected, her tone polite but entirely unyielding. "However, we are citing an urgent matter of tribal royalty account integrity. Under the provisions of our federal charter, matters concerning the immediate security of tribal funds require expedited administrative review." Before the secretary could formulate a response, the heavy oak door to the adjacent office opened, and Deputy Regional Director Harold Spence stepped into the reception area. He was tall, silver-haired, and wore a perfectly pressed suit. He carried a stack of routing slips, projecting the measured, unbothered aura of a man who controlled the flow of information. He saw Begay and stopped, a brief flicker of calculation crossing his eyes, before settling into a practiced, welcoming smile. "Walter," Spence said, stepping forward and extending a hand that Begay did not take. "I wasn't aware you were coming up to Albuquerque this week. If there is an issue with the accounts, my office can certainly handle it. There is no need to disrupt the regional director's morning. Why don't you and your associate step into my office, and we can review whatever discrepancies your auditor thinks she has found?" Spence's attempt to redirect the meeting was smooth, an administrative reflex designed to keep volatile matters contained within his own sphere of influence. He assumed, naturally, that whatever Runningwater had found was still manageable, still something he could bury under a mountain of procedural delays or blame entirely on a rogue records clerk. Morningstar turned to look at Spence. She did not introduce herself. She simply held his gaze with a cold, analytical detachment. "We decline that invitation, Mr. Spence. We have requested the regional director." She offered no explanation, no justification, and no room for negotiation. Spence's smile tightened at the corners. He was used to being agreed with, used to the deference his title commanded. "I am the deputy director," he said, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "Account integrity falls under my direct purview." "Then you will undoubtedly be asked to attend the meeting," Morningstar replied, turning her back on him and looking expectantly at the secretary. "Please inform Director Pratt that we are waiting." The secretary, sensing the shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room, stood up and disappeared into the regional director's office. A moment later, she returned and held the door open. Owen Pratt, the regional director, sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He was a career civil servant, a man who viewed the BIA not as a fiefdom, but as a complex regulatory apparatus that required constant, careful maintenance. He had no stake in the Coronado Land Services arrangement. He did not even know it existed beyond a name on a ledger. He had, however, received a highly irregular draft memorandum from Spence late the previous afternoon, a memo detailing the supposed unauthorized activities of a records clerk named Raymond Tsosi. The sudden arrival of the tribal council's leadership, citing account integrity, immediately activated Pratt's institutional survival instincts. "Come in, Walter," Pratt said, standing up and gesturing to the large conference table situated on the left side of his office. He looked at Morningstar. "And you must be Ms. Morningstar. Please, have a seat." Pratt glanced toward the open door. "Harold, since this apparently concerns account integrity, you had better join us. Close the door behind you." Spence stepped into the office, his jaw set. He could not refuse the summons without creating the immediate appearance of obstruction,
but being commanded to attend a meeting he could not control was a severe tactical disadvantage. He took a seat at the far end of the table, crossing his legs and adopting a posture of mild, cooperative interest.
"I have also asked Della Runningwater to join us," Begay said, taking his seat. "She is waiting in the records reading room." Pratt pressed the intercom button on his desk and instructed his secretary to send the auditor in. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. 2 minutes later, the door opened, and Della Runningwater entered. She carried her canvas satchel over her shoulder. She did not look intimidated by the executive surroundings, nor did she look triumphant. She looked exactly as she always did, methodical, patient, and entirely focused on the mathematics of her task. "Ms. Runningwater," Pratt said, "Mr. Begay informs me you have uncovered an issue regarding tribal royalty accounts. The floor is yours." Runningwater approached the conference table. She unbuckled her canvas satchel and began to extract her materials. She did not rush. She placed her pre-ruled ledger sheets on the polished mahogany. She placed a rigid file folder beside them. Finally, she produced a small, spiral-bound notebook containing her transcriptions of the flat file access log. "Over the past 6 days, I've conducted a routine reconciliation of mineral royalty disbursements against the original cadastral survey maps for a block of 12 parcels in the San Juan Basin area," Runningwater began, her voice maintaining its usual calm, even cadence. "During this reconciliation, I identified a severe irregularity." She slid the first document across the table toward Pratt. "This is a transcription of the quarterly disbursement ledger for the past 14 months. You will note that the royalties for parcel reference number 402-A, which rightfully belong to tribal account 7741, have been consistently diverted to a payee listed as Coronado Land Services." Pratt adjusted his glasses and looked at the ledger sheet. "Coronado Land Services. Is this an authorized intermediary account?" "It is not," Runningwater stated. She placed a second, empty file folder on the table. "I requested the intermediary account authorization file for the entire regional office. The file contained no authorization, no escrow agreement, and no subcontractor documentation for Coronado Land Services. The entity is receiving federal disbursements without any underlying administrative justification." Spence leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Administrative oversights happen, Ms. Runningwater. A missing authorization form does not necessarily indicate a systemic failure. It is entirely possible the paperwork was misfiled by the records department." Runningwater did not look at Spence. She opened her rigid file folder and extracted the tracing paper she had prepared the previous afternoon. She placed it precisely in the center of the table. "This is not an administrative oversight," Runningwater said. "This is a deliberate alteration of the foundational records." She pointed to the red and blue pencil lines on the tracing paper. "I compared the parcel reference numbers on the original cadastral map against the numbers on the transfer authorization documents. For 11 of the 12 parcels, the numbers match perfectly. For the affected parcel, they do not. The transfer document lists the parcel as 409-A. The original cadastral map, however, shows a visible hand-inked alteration. The number 2 was changed to a 9. The ink color and stroke weight of that single digit are inconsistent with the surrounding entries. The cadastral map was altered to match a fraudulent transfer document, thereby redirecting the royalties." Pratt stared at the tracing. The visual evidence was stark, reproducible, and undeniable. The machinery of the BIA relied entirely on the absolute sanctity of the original cadastral maps. An alteration of an original map was not a clerical error. It was a federal crime. "Who has access to these original maps?" Pratt asked, his voice hardening. "The original cadastral flat files are kept in a locked cabinet in the records room," Runningwater explained, opening her spiral notebook. "Access requires a supervisor's key and must be logged. I formally requested the access log for the past 18 months. She pushed the notebook toward Pratt. The log shows 2 retrievals of the San Juan Basin files outside of documented work orders.
Both undocumented retrievals occurred 14 months ago, aligning perfectly with the date Coronado Land Services was registered in the payee system.
"And who made those retrievals?" Pratt asked. Before Running Water could answer, Spence interrupted. His voice was loud, cutting through the methodical rhythm of the auditor's presentation. "The undocumented access log entries belong to Raymond Tsosi," Spence stated, looking directly at Pratt. "He is the records clerk assigned to that archive. And this, Director Pratt, is exactly what I warned you about." Spence reached into his jacket pocket and produced a carbon copy of the internal memorandum he had routed to Pratt's office the previous morning. He slid it across the table. He moved with the absolute confidence of a man who believed he had successfully insulated himself from the blast radius of his own corruption. "I submitted that memorandum to your office yesterday morning, Director," Spence continued, his tone shifting into one of grave administrative concern. "Before Ms. Runningwater brought these allegations forward, I had already identified Mr. Tsosi as a troubled employee who possessed unsupervised access to original cadastral records. I noted in my report that he appeared to be making unauthorized alterations for personal reasons. The fact that the access logs bear his identification code only confirms my preliminary investigation. Tsosi altered the map. Tsosi manipulated the transfer document. He is the sole responsible party." Pratt looked at the memo, then at the access log transcript. The bureaucratic logic was sound. Spence had documented his suspicions before the audit was complete, establishing a paper trail that placed the entirety of the blame squarely on the lowest-ranking employee with physical access to the room. It was a perfect, self-contained narrative. Morningstar leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on the table. "Director Pratt, has anyone contacted Raymond Tsosi this morning to hear his account of these log entries?" "Mr. Tsosi is not in the building," Pratt replied, glancing at his secretary through the open door. "He called in absent at 8 o'clock this morning. He gave no reason." Spence offered a small, grim smile. "Flight is often the most reliable indicator of guilt, Ms. Morningstar." Tsosi knew the auditor was looking at the San Juan files. He knew his unauthorized access would be discovered. He has abandoned his post. At that exact moment, the heavy oak door to the outer office opened. The secretary looked up, startled. Pratt frowned at the interruption. Spence turned his head, fully expecting to see a messenger or a clerk delivering the morning mail. Raymond Tsosi walked into the room. He wore the same brown sport coat he wore every day. His face was drawn, the skin tight across his cheekbones, and his eyes carried the heavy, hollow look of a man who had not slept. He did not look like a man who was fleeing. He looked like a man who had finally reached the end of a very long, very dark corridor, and had decided to stop running. In his right hand, he carried a plain, unmarked manila envelope. "Mr. Tsosi," Pratt said, his voice registering profound surprise. "You called in absent." "I did, sir," Tsosi said. His voice was quiet, precise by habit, but it did not tremble. He walked slowly past Spence, refusing to acknowledge the deputy director's presence, and stopped at the edge of the conference table, directly across from Sylvia Morningstar. Tsosi looked down at the array of documents Runningwater had laid out, the ledger, the tracing, the access logs. He saw the architecture of his own coerced crime laid bare under the fluorescent lights. He took a slow, shallow breath. He set the plain envelope on the meeting room table. The sound of the carbon copy being placed on the meeting room table, a soft, almost weightless sound, disproportionate to what it contains, seemed to echo in the sudden, absolute stillness of the room. "Inside this envelope," Tsosi said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotional inflection, "is the carbon copy of the original transfer authorization order for the affected parcel in the San Juan Basin block. It is dated 14 months ago." He paused, his eyes fixing on the polished wood of the table. "It bears the initials of the person who authorized the transaction in the approval field." He did not look at Spence when he said this. He did not need to. Morningstar reached out and pulled the envelope toward her. She opened the flap and carefully extracted the document. It was a standard BIA transfer authorization form, printed on flimsy, translucent carbon paper. She smoothed it out and placed it directly beside Running Water's traced comparison of the cadastral map. The overhead light in the meeting room catching the blue-black impression of Spence's initials on the carbon copy, pressed deeper into the paper than the surrounding text, unambiguous under direct light, illuminated the exact mechanism of the fraud. Morningstar studied the document for 10 seconds. When she spoke, her voice was a surgical instrument. "Director Pratt," Morningstar said, tapping the carbon copy with her index finger. "I direct your attention to the parcel reference number on this original authorization order. It reads 402-A. This number matches the original, unaltered cadastral map. It does not match the altered transfer document currently residing in the active files, which reads 409-A. Pratt stood up and leaned over the table, his eyes darting between the tracing and the carbon copy. "Furthermore," Morningstar continued, her logic closing around the room like a steel trap, "I direct your attention to the approval field at the bottom of this document. It bears the authorizing initials H.S. Harold Spence. Because this authorization order bears the original correct parcel number, it proves unequivocally that this document was signed and approved before the alteration to the cadastral map was ever made." She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto Spence. "The alteration was made to match a fraudulent transfer document that was substituted into the file after you authorized the original correct transaction. You did not discover an alteration, Mr. Spence. You ordered one." Spence's face lost its color, the practiced administrative mask shattering into a look of naked, cornered panic. He stared at the blue-black initials on the carbon paper as if they were venomous. He had assumed Tsosi would simply destroy the evidence, or that the lack of a paper trail would protect him. He had never considered that the quiet, precise records clerk would have the foresight to hide a carbon copy in a duplicate allotment folder 2 rooms away. "That is a fabrication," Spence stated, his voice rising, the measured cadence entirely gone. He pointed a trembling finger at Tsosi. "He fabricated that document. He had access to the typewriters. He had access to the carbon paper. He forged my initials to protect himself." Pratt slowly straightened up. He looked at the carbon copy, then at the memo Spence had handed him only minutes before. The regional director was not a detective, but he understood the immutable laws of bureaucratic logic. Pratt looked at his deputy director. "Explain to me, Harold," Pratt said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register, "why a fabricated carbon copy, created by a clerk trying to protect himself, would show your own initials authorizing a transaction that your own memo claims Mr. Tsosi acted on without authorization." Spence opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The logical paradox was absolute. If Tsosi had altered the records on his own, as Spence claimed, there would be no authorized transfer order bearing Spence's initials for the original parcel. The existence of the document proved that Spence was involved in the transaction before the fraud occurred. The quality of the silence in the meeting room after Pratt's unanswered question to Spence, not dramatic but administrative, the silence of a process that has completed one phase and not yet begun the next, was suffocating. It was the sound of a career ending, of a federal hierarchy violently realigning itself. Pratt turned toward the open door. "Gloria!" he called out. Gloria Atsidi, who had been summoned by the secretary to serve as the official keeper of the flat file log, was standing in the doorway. She held the master logbook against her chest. She had heard everything. She looked at Tsosi, who kept his eyes fixed on the floor, and then she looked at Spence, the man who had tried to force her to take a side. "Ms. Atsidi," Pratt said, "you maintain the flat file access logs. Are the entries transcribed by Ms. Runningwater authentic and unaltered?" Atsidi stepped into the room. She did not hesitate. "They are authentic, Director Pratt, and they are unaltered. I witnessed the retrievals myself. I noted the procedural irregularity at the time." Her voice was soft,
but it carried the absolute weight of the archive. She had made her choice.
Pratt nodded slowly. He turned back to the table. "Harold," he said, his tone entirely devoid of its former collegiality, "effective immediately, you are suspended from all duties as Deputy Regional Director, pending a full federal investigation. You will surrender your keys and your identification to my secretary. You will not return to your office."
Spence stood frozen, his eyes darting toward the door, then back to the carbon copy that had destroyed him. He slowly reached into his pocket, extracted his keyring, and dropped it on the mahogany table. It landed with a harsh metallic clatter. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, a ghost haunting his own bureaucracy. Pratt did not watch him leave. He picked up the heavy black rotary phone on his desk. He dialed a long-distance number from memory. "Get me the Bureau of Indian Affairs Office of Inspector General," he said into the receiver. "Yes, I will hold. We have a critical breach of account integrity in the Albuquerque regional office involving a senior administrator." While Pratt waited on the line, Morningstar began organizing the documents on the table. "Director Pratt," she said, her voice cutting through the background static of the telephone receiver. "On behalf of the Tribal Council, I formally request that all original documents related to this matter, including the cadastral map, the transfer file, the disbursement ledger, and the carbon copy provided by Mr. Tsosi, be secured immediately under joint Tribal Council and federal custody." Pratt covered the mouthpiece of the phone. "Agreed. My secretary will facilitate the custody chain documentation." 10 minutes later, the bureaucratic ritual of securing evidence commenced. Running Water stood beside the secretary's desk in the outer office, carefully placing each document into a heavy, reinforced federal evidence envelope. She countersigned the custody chain log, her signature neat and precise, right beneath the secretary's sprawling script. Together they walked down the corridor to a windowless storage office. The secretary unlocked the door, and Running Water placed the sealed envelopes inside a metal lockbox bolted to the floor. They closed the door, and the secretary produced a roll of thick, red Federal Seal adhesive tape. She applied it across the door frame and the lock, pressing it firmly into the wood. This was the moment the case formally moved out of the BIA administrative process and into federal oversight. The internal mechanisms of delay and obfuscation were dead. The machinery of federal prosecution had taken over. Down the hall, in a small, sparsely furnished interview room, Raymond Tsosi sat alone at a metal table. A BIA internal affairs officer, who had arrived 20 minutes earlier at the request of Bigay's attorney, stood by the door. Tsosi had not been placed under arrest, but the officer had informed him, in a voice devoid of malice or sympathy, that his own role in the alteration of federal records would be subject to a separate, formal proceeding. The duress under which he had acted would be weighed, but the fact of the alteration remained. Tsosi sat with his hands folded on the table. He did not ask for a glass of water. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not say anything further. He looked at the blank wall opposite him, feeling a strange, hollow sense of relief. The suffocating weight of the secret, the constant, agonizing vigilance of the past 14 months, was gone. He had burned his own life to the ground, but he had made sure Harold Spence burned with him. His desk in the records room was clean. His ledger was closed. Out in the main corridor, Walter Bigay and Della Running Water stood together, watching the secretary walk away from the newly sealed door. The smell of the corridor outside the secured office, floor wax, and the faint metallic smell of the Federal Seal adhesive, a smell that is institutional and final, hung heavily in the air. It was the scent of a bureaucracy attempting to sterilize its own wounds. Bigay turned to Running Water. The older man looked tired, the adrenaline of the confrontation fading into the grim reality of the aftermath. "How long will it take you to calculate the full amount of the diverted royalties?" he asked, his voice low. Running Water adjusted the strap of her canvas satchel. "I have the disbursement ledgers for the past 8 quarters, she replied, her mind already returning to the mathematics of the theft. "I can have a preliminary figure by the following afternoon."
Bigay nodded slowly. He looked past her, his eyes fixing on the bright red federal seal stretched across the doorframe. The families who were owed that money, Bigay said, his voice carrying the weight of 100 broken treaties and 1,000 missing ledgers, are going to want to know it is coming back. Running Water looked at the seal, then back at Bigay. She tightened her grip on her satchel. She did not answer him because she did not yet know whether it will. The ledger could prove a theft had occurred. It could identify the thief. It could even calculate the exact sum of the loss down to the final decimal point. But Della Running Water knew better than anyone that proving a debt existed in a federal building was not the same thing as forcing the federal government to pay it. The mathematics were perfect, but the justice was still entirely unwritten.